Street photography. My first photography love. There's just something about street photography that speaks to me in so many different ways. The art, the randomness, the curiosity. It's just such an intriguing genre of photography as a whole, both in its past form and its present. Street photography is many things to many people. Some people call it candid photography. Some people describe it as a record of everyday life in an everyday space, and others define it to be all about chance and random encounters in the mundane. And all of that is true, in my opinion. All of those descriptions are just different focuses and ways that we can express ourselves through street photography. Now, while there are many ways to talk about what street photography is, my definition of it, as I've mentioned before in the genre overview lesson, is that street photography is simply the documentation of the human condition. It's simply the expression of us as a human race, but done in an urban setting. And for me, that very broad definition is very intentional, leaving us to interpret that in many, many different ways and pursue the expression of that in just as many as well. Historically, street photography has been seen as perhaps one of the most artistic genres of photography. With that, it has also seen and continues to see perhaps the most amount of snobbery and gatekeeping out of all of the genres of photography. While there are many things to enjoy about street photography, I just want to say here at the start of the lesson that street photography, they have the most amount of elitists who have very particular views on how this genre should be and shouldn't be. And a lot of them are still holding on to values of the past, which is fine, but some of them to the detriment of seeing what's right in front of them in the modern era. Now, I say this because I consider myself to be very good at street photography and very well educated on its history as well. But I find myself now deliberately staying out of the street photography community because it can be toxic to the most intense degree, especially in some cities more than others. I'm looking at you, New York. Because of this, if you've spent any time already in a street photography community of some sort, I know there will be some information in this lesson that some people will undoubtedly disagree with. And that's fine. Everyone is allowed to have their own perspectives, but I understand that what I'm teaching you here will inherently shape your worldview on this genre of photography. And if you so choose to adopt that thinking as well, then you may or may not encounter some resistance toward some people in that community. Anyway, with all of that being said, flipping the switch now, street photography is amazing, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's by far the most technical form of photography, and it's also the genre of photography with the greatest potential for artistic expression, in my opinion. But of course, I'm biased because I started my entire journey with street photography. But hey, at least you can see that I'm passionate about it. For me, I love so many of the different aspects of it, but a few stand out more than others. One of those things is having a general acceptance of things as they are, and then having the curiosity to wonder about it and then follow up on it. Roaming around the streets, seeing people live and wondering what they're up to and what they're doing, imagining their stories and their lives and their joys and their sorrows. I love the idea of making dedicated time to be interested in what the people in the world around you are actually doing on a day-to-day basis. Life can get really busy sometimes and it can move by you in a flash, but a great way to slow it all down and to enjoy the life that you have is to be interested and invested in the present moment. And I think street photography really helps in that way. Something else I really enjoy about street photography is the randomness. With street, you just don't know what you're going to get. In fact, it's much better if you start a session with absolutely zero expectation of what is going to happen. Pick an area of a city to roam around in for a few hours and just see what you see. Sometimes you can take hundreds of images and walk away with a few really nice ones that you're actually going to keep. And then other days you might spend hours and hours over thousands of steps walking away with absolutely nothing. And sometimes there might be conditions that you don't think are favorable, but you end up going out anyway and you end up with some of your most favorite images. And then other times you'll see favorable conditions and your favorite kind of light, and then you'll return home with nothing else but steps logged. With street photography, you just don't know what you're going to get. And that means you have to always be in it to win it. But there's no guarantee that you're going to win it. Street photography favors consistency over the reward. And I think because of that, there's tremendous benefit in seeing the act of street photography as a practice rather than something that you master per se. But another thing that I love about it is that the more time that you put into street and the more time you put into learning different visual patterns, the better you get at it and the more keepers you end up having. You can literally watch your strike rate increase over time. And more on this in a moment. But with street, there's so much variety in shooting styles and genres to the point where your expression is really limited by your own imagination and expertise. Well, like I mentioned before, street photography is simply the documentation of the human condition. That means that you can shoot it in whatever genre you want or whatever style you want to shoot it in, so long as it has humans in some way. And most of the time, that does mean shooting candid of people, but it could just as well be a street portrait of a stranger as well. Other times, it could also be an expression of the environment that humans live in as well. It's very broad and doesn't really benefit anyone except for the gatekeepers from having such hard, well-defined lines. So let's not have them. Now, to do street photography, just head out somewhere in your city, armed with a camera in hand, and just shoot whatever looks interesting to you. Initially, don't overthink it. Just shoot anything and everything. Shoot it in whatever method or whatever style or technique that you can. Just make sure you come home with a few hundred images. And when I say images, by the way, I mean deliberate images. I don't mean holding onto the shutter button and taking a few dozen images of the same thing with the same composition as a single burst. I mean deliberate images. That one burst counts as one image. Going out there with the intention to make so many images is important at the start, because in reality, there are so many different styles and themes and methods of street photography that you won't really know what you like until you find it. It actually pays quite a bit to do some research on some famous street photographers and absorb and immerse yourself in different styles, and then go out there and try to replicate those styles for yourself. And you do that through making a lot of mistakes and trying out a lot of things and doing a lot of experiments and analyzing what you return with at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, if you've been wandering around the city, camera in hand, it's more likely that most of your shots will qualify as street photography in the broadest sense of the term. From there, the game is really about understanding, finding, and then defining what you like taking photos of in a street photography context. And that requires tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images to find. As some examples, one of my favorite street photographers when I was first starting was a man named Bruce Gilden. He is an American street photographer who was really famous for his candid close-up portraits. He would do this very aggressive approach that I would never recommend anyone would do, where he would have a flash and then quickly go up to people and shoot them point blank in the face with camera and flash in hand, and then he would quickly run away. And it sounds super duper crude and totally invasive, and it is. And again, I don't recommend this approach to anyone, but you can't deny that the style of photos he created was so unique. Now, keep in mind that I don't actually like the look of his photographic style at all. I think the way that the portraits come out can be crude and ugly, and most of the time he gets, in my opinion, like the worst expressions out of people. But from an artistic perspective, there's just something about the process of what he does that is so alluring to me. That style of candid, close up and personal photography takes a tremendous amount of courage to do that kind of work. And because of that, his body of work is so unique because of it. Now, another one of my favorite street photographers who is definitely more towards my style and definitely more socially acceptable is a guy named Fan Ho. Fan Ho was a street photographer based in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s. But what I love about his work is that he's a master of form, subject, and contrast. His works always contain a lot of shapes. There are plenty of lines and angles and shapes in his work, and while they're not always perfect, they're very real and very raw. And I can see very clearly in his work that the idea of subject is very, very important to him, and he uses many different techniques to ensure that no matter what the image is, you know as the viewer what you are looking at. You know the subject, which is a very hard thing to do in street photography. And then, lastly, he has this style of contrast that I use in my work as well. Hard contrast, bright highlights, and dark shadows. And there's actually this motto that I say quite often that I think of when I see his work, and that goes, let your highlights be bright and your shadows be dark, in both photography and in life. And I love this quote because, without the dark, you wouldn't have anything to light. And without the light, you wouldn't be able to see in the dark. They work in balance, always. And neither one is not good nor bad, but they are both required and are two sides of the same coin. Now, with Fan Ho, it's actually kind of funny because I had actually never heard about him until just a few years ago. And what I saw in his work was almost exactly what I saw in my own work, even having not seen a single photo from him before in my life. And to be honest, it really shocked me, and I really resonated with his style of work, and that was a really special moment for me. Now, there are so many different kinds of photographers to draw inspiration from, and those are just two of them. So spend some time researching to find some that really resonate with you. And when you do see something that you like, when you see someone's work that you like, ask yourself exactly why you like it, what you like about it, what about it calls to you, whether or not you'd be able to replicate that style for yourself and understand exactly what goes behind that shot. Get out there, practice it, get good at it, add it to your toolbox, grow your toolbox over time. And then over the next few years, you'll start to notice that when you fall back on certain techniques over others, that is your street photography style. When it comes to gear in street photography, in my opinion, there are two main things to consider: focal length and autofocus. Let's tackle the first one, focal length. When it comes to focal lengths, your consideration here is really about how comfortable you are getting close to your subjects. Let's be real here. Street photography can be a very, very confronting genre of photography to do. Oftentimes, we're looking for candid images, and in many cases, the closer we can physically get to someone to take the shot, the more authentic and relatable it becomes. That being said, shooting street images up close and personal on a 24mm lens, especially ones where the subject fills the frame, is hard and confronting and can be really daunting. Now, we'll talk more about this in the specialist techniques section, but for now, know that the wider you go, the closer you'll end up being to your subjects. Because of this, some people like to start with something more like an 85 or use a 7200 or something like that so that they can photograph people from a distance. And that's a really great way to start out gently in street photography. I know that for me personally, 85 and specifically a fast 85 like 1.4 works pretty well for me. And it's a setup that I do find myself coming back to often, even though I've been through the entire range and practiced with all of the focal lengths. But that's where I landed for the types of compositions that I make. Now, I encourage you to start at 85 or 50 if you're a bit apprehensive about photographing people up close. And then from there, after you get a little bit more comfortable with that, you can, try out maybe 35 or 24 after a few months in the game. When it comes to the speed of your lenses, you don't specifically need to have a fast lens like f1.4, but in many cases, it does help tremendously with subject separation. We'll go more into this in the specialist techniques section, but historically, street photographers used to use the hyperfocal distance techniques where they would lock in their apertures at around f8. This is because back in the day, autofocus wasn't really that great, and with all of the tricky ways you can photograph in street photography, like shooting from the hip, for example, doing this was a reliable way to ensure that subjects would be in focus. But again, we will cover this a little bit more later on. While we're on the subject of autofocus though, that's another thing to consider when it comes to gear in street photography. When it comes to camera bodies, if you think you're going to be doing a lot of street photography, then I would highly suggest that you go for a camera that has really good autofocus capabilities and then learning all of the different autofocus modes back to front. Having great autofocus means that you'll hit your targets and subjects more often and thus reliably get more keepers when you're out shooting. Focus, when it comes to street photography, can be quite difficult at times, especially when either moving really fast and the subjects are really close, or when the subjects are really small on a larger composition. And being able to pick your subjects quickly using autofocus is a huge help when it comes to your strike rate. Aside from autofocus and focal length considerations, there isn't anything too major here. You don't need a tripod for street, and unless you're really at the top end of refining your style, and if you are, what are you doing in a beginner's course anyway? You don't really need to make too many other considerations about things like sensor sizes. I will say though that street photography does have a large fear component to it that we all need to get over. To help that, sometimes a smaller camera can seem more inconspicuous and thus allow you to feel more comfortable taking images. When I don't have my big cameras with me, I always travel with my tiny RX100 pocket camera, which is an absolute blast to take street images with because it's a 24 to 200 zoom lens and no one ever stops to consider that you're taking serious shots with it, which just takes the pressure off shooting in public quite a bit. Just something to consider. Okay, when it comes to typical settings, I'll go through the typical foundational settings that you'll find yourself using mostly if you're shooting normally. But then in the specialist techniques section, that's where things can change a little bit because street photography has some interesting focusing techniques that I would really like to cover. Okay, so for typical street, we're always shooting humans, so moving subject shutter speed rules apply. What we're looking at here is enough shutter speed to freeze the action. Now, if we recall back to the shutter speed lesson, a great starting place for that is around 1/400th of a second, depending on the size and the speed of your subjects moving in your composition. And again, if your subjects are smaller or moving slower in your frame, then perhaps you could get away with a slightly slower shutter speed depending on the scene. But typically you want to be on the faster side if you are looking to freeze the action properly. For me, especially if I'm shooting street with an f1.4 lens, which I often am, I really like to crank my shutter way past 1/1000th of a second as a minimum. This, for 95% of cases that I find myself shooting in, ensures that I have enough shutter speed to freeze the action in almost all of the compositions that I would typically shoot in, leaving only my focus to really worry about when it comes to freezing the action and getting sharp shots. And personally, I think that in street photography, more so than any other genre, it is perhaps more acceptable, I guess, to have blurry trails of people walking. But again, this is all about intentionality. If you've accidentally shot something a little bit slower than you should have, and the person ends up blurry, own up to it and correct yourself next time and try to freeze the action in a better way next time. Blurry people can have the look of motion though, and that's why it can be a little bit more acceptable in a street context. But if you do that, make sure it's on purpose and keep yourself accountable and don't hide behind your mistakes saying that it's artsy or what have you. Again, intentionality is key. Otherwise, similar to the typical gear section, the other thing is autofocus. Mastering your autofocus is absolutely key here because doing so ensures that you walk away with a lot more usable shots on your adventures out there in the urban jungle. Now, what we want to use for street photography is an autofocus continuous type of mode. This is the mode that's called AFC or Servo AF. This will allow our focus point to be able to constantly poll one specific location that we select in our composition. Once we have that set, we can also choose a focus area. And this is all very much preference to experiment with different focus areas. As a general recommendation though, I would suggest moving away from the wider focus areas and selecting something with just a little bit more granular control. on the Sony systems, the tracking and flexible spot modes are my personal favorite, as it allows you to have control over a very small region and a very small box, which you can control either by the joystick or the touch on the screen. And then once you've acquired the focus, it will automatically lock onto that target for you and then keep it focused. Any focus area with tracking is just useful in general so that you can then let the camera do most of the work there. But if you don't have such a new camera, then I would definitely recommend with going for a more spot-like focus area and then controlling that spot every single time you want to focus. Now, you might see some street photographers using manual mode, claiming that it has more control or touting other benefits. And while personal preference is most certainly subjective, a masterful control over autofocus will outperform masterful control over manual focus any day of the week. That's just the facts. That being said, some people actually prefer the more tactile manual feel of focusing, so they do that instead. I'm not recommending it, especially since the advent of autofocus is just so good and the skill is so transferable across many genres of photography, but it's worth mentioning anyway at this point. Okay, let's talk about some techniques that are very specific to street photography. In this section, I'm going to be talking about a couple of hard craft techniques that you can use while out there on the street, but most of this section is actually going to be more related to softer techniques, softer craft techniques that good street photography requires, that is very much unlike any other genre of photography. You know, that's where a lot of the interesting stuff lies, so I encourage you to hang on until I reach them. I know it's been a long video already. Hipfire refers to shooting blindly towards your subject, usually from the hip, in such a way where you don't actually look at the camera and you frame your composition without looking at all, and you just kind of blindly shoot, and hopefully you have things framed up instinctually and correctly. While some people might see this as a little bit voyeuristic, and to be honest, they're kind of right, there is also something to be said about doing everything that you can to ensure the image you're taking is as candid as it can be. And oftentimes, the more candid the image, the better. The more that people don't realize that you're photographing them and the more pure you are able to capture them, usually the better your shots turn out overall. Now, hipfire is extremely difficult to do well and requires a lot of practice to get right and to frame your images without looking. And there really is, unfortunately, no substitute for a lot of practice here, and it'll take you hours upon hours of dedicated practice to start to be able to hipfire well and to frame your images without looking. There are a few things that will help you in the process though. And one major way to boost your success of hipfire is actually to use a neck strap for your camera and then dangle your camera from your neck. When you try to shoot, because the neck strap is always at the same height, the only other thing you really need to worry about is the tilt of the camera. This removes one variable and allows you to get used to getting the tilt right first. And then after getting good at shooting from your camera strap, then try it without the strap and then freehand it. Shooting freehand is definitely a lot harder, but it is a lot easier once you start getting good at the tilt of the camera over time. But again, this does take a very, very long time to get good at, so please be patient with yourself. The other thing that can really help is making sure that you're always in focus. The aim of the game in general is to make it as easy as possible for yourself to repeat this technique time and time again. And that means making as many things as possible as easy as possible. Now with focus, we can definitely just rely on autofocus using a predictable, repeatable focus area like center point or wide. And that does work quite a lot of the time, especially if you're shooting a little bit closer using a 24, 35 or 50mm lens, for example. But the other way that we can do it is using the power of zone focusing. Now there used to be a saying in the history of street photography: F8 and be there. Because street photography is just so rapid and so fast and so quick, which is also why I recommend that everyone learn street photography first, because it has tremendous crossover. Street photographers needed a way back in the day to be able to reliably take a lot of images quickly while making sure that they were keeping their images in focus every single time. And back in the day, autofocus wasn't as good as it is today, so everyone used manual focus lenses. But what people found out is that there's a phenomenon called hyperfocal distance. Now, we've already learned about hyperfocal distance over a week ago, but as a little bit of a refresher, hyperfocal distance refers to the closest distance from the camera to which everything after the point of hyperfocal distance will be in focus, or what's known as focused to infinity. Remember that there are slight differences between depth of field and the hyperfocal distance. Depth of field measures the span of space that is specifically in focus depending on how far away the focus point is. Hyperfocal distance is the distance between the camera and the subject to which the point after everything will be focused to infinity. Hyperfocal distance has two main parameters that are important to know. The first one is the actual hyperfocal distance itself. Think of this as the distance between you and your focus point. How far away your focus point is determines your depth of field and your second hyperfocal distance parameter, the near hyperfocal distance. The near hyperfocal distance is the very start of the depth of field, and it sits in front of the point of focus. In street photography, 35 millimeters used to be and still is one of the most popular focal lengths to use. And at some point, they figured out that using a 35 millimeter focal length plus setting their apertures to f8 would mean that so long as they were manual focusing to 5.18 meters away, that so long as their subjects were within the near hyperfocal distance of 2.59 meters, that everything from that point onwards would be in focus. How handy is that? Imagine knowing that everything that's approximately a human length and a half away would be in focus. It would mean that you would never have to focus again. When paired with a fast enough shutter speed, the only real things you would have to consider are your ISO to compensate for the available light, obviously. But aside from that, then you could just shoot images super fast and know that they would be reliably in focus every single time. Zone focusing. That's what this was all about. Dialing in all of your settings ahead of time. Then all you have to do is show up and snap. F8 and be there. Of course, nowadays we have autofocus, which in many cases can be super fast and allows us to use apertures like f1.4 for adding shallow depth of field to our images as well. But back in the day, this technique was what everyone was doing. Now, I would highly recommend that you try out zone focusing at some point. Manual focusing and hip firing are perhaps two of the most interesting and challenging techniques in all of photography, and knowing these principles well will serve you tremendously down the line. Okay, this isn't specifically a technique per se, but the rest of the section is going to focus on the more soft techniques and the soft skills of street photography. And something that comes up quite commonly is the issue of permission. So I refer to permission here in terms of whether or not it's even okay to take photos of people on the street, like whether or not there are legal issues against doing so, and whether or not there are even moral issues doing so as well. I'd say that in most places around the world, it's actually perfectly legal to take images of people if they are out in public. And I know that this is the case as of this recording in the US, Australia, Japan. And as a general rule of thumb, so long as these images are not forms of harassment or something along those lines, in most countries, it's totally fine. You know, this is how journalism and the news industry has survived this entire time. However, there have been recent developments about street photography in Europe specifically, with complications around the GDPR and having consent and what have you. And so I would say in this instance, make sure to look up in your own country what the laws and regulations are so that you know where you stand. So long as you're educated in the actual laws in your own country, then you can decide for yourself if what you're doing is morally correct or not. And I mention morals because this is something that comes up a lot in street photography too. You know, I'd say that the majority of non-photographers out there, so most of the world, don't really like having their photo taken just in general. But there's a difference between someone who doesn't want to have their photo taken, but is in a public place and is lawfully allowed to have their photo taken by someone else without their consent, and whether or not they actually confront you about it. I think it also comes down to how you take those images as well. You know, street photography can, in some cases, depending on how you do it, seem creepy or voyeuristic to some people, which is totally fair enough, and I get that. So, from a moral perspective, there's definitely a consideration to be made for yourself in terms of where you draw the line. For example, I know a lot of people who don't shoot homeless people, for example, as well. But that all leads me to the next point, which is getting over fear. If you know you have the legal right to take photographs of people, then getting over the fear of actually doing it is quite difficult. It can be super confronting to take photos of other people in public, but it does help to prepare yourself in how to respond to certain situations if you do get confronted about it. And the more times you do get confronted about it, the less fear inducing it becomes. To help get used to the confrontation, I would say that the number one thing is to lean into the confrontation and not lean back from it. And I don't mean be confrontational. I just mean that when you shy away from a situation and you look sus and insecure and anxious after having taken an image of someone who looks uncomfortable about it, that makes the entire situation and the entire scenario worse. That makes them suspect that what you're doing is something dodgy and that something is up, and it will actually increase your chances of them confronting you about it or doing something potentially more drastic. What you should do instead is, if they're uncomfortable, talk to them, interact with them, compliment them on their hair or their smile or whatever it was that you were photographing. Be nice to them and give them the time of day. Chances are, if you're taking a photo of them, there was something about them that interests you. Show them the image that you've taken and share with them why you took it and what interested you in the first place. And they might actually be super happy about it. Over my career, I've had many confrontations that were both pleasurable, happy, memorable experiences, but I've also had ones that have been very negative and very even angry experiences. On the more happy side, I've had people be so thrilled with my shots. Some of them have even asked me to send it to them. Some of them followed me on Instagram. Some of them have beaming smiles and were so thrilled to have the photo taken. Some even posed for me. On the negative side, people have gotten angry at me, yelled at me, called me names, chased me, yelling out to me to delete images and so on and so forth. And I've shown the images that I've taken to the really angry people, and I've deleted those images in front of them on a few occasions where they've really arced up about it. But I also would encourage you to take that approach as well. Even if you are legally allowed to take the photo, it doesn't mean that you should take the same stance morally. If someone wants their photo deleted, then delete the photo. There are plenty more where they came from anyway. Now, that all being said, there are techniques that I and other street photographers use to pretend like we're not actually shooting the subject that we're shooting, so that we can keep the entire situation candid and conflict free. Again, this is a case of morals, so use these techniques at your discretion. Now, the first one is what I call shooting past someone. And basically, you frame up your shot and wait for the subject to be in the perfect position. But before they get there, you take a few photos. And then you take the photo that you want in the composition that you want. And then once they're out of the frame and continuing to, walk towards you or past you, you keep taking photos of the same composition with no one in it. And that way, the subject will think that you're actually shooting the context and the scene and the composition and not that specific person. And if you show your interest in the scene itself, it's an easy way to diffuse the intent towards the subject. Now, this works really well when the subject is walking towards you, as if you keep on shooting, the closer your subject becomes, the more likely they'll just think that, what you're actually shooting is behind them and not actually them. The second one is blind firing, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You hold your camera in an angle that doesn't look like you're trying to frame a shot, and not just from the hip. It might be like down from your sides, or like you might have your hands crossed or something like that. From that position, you shoot and you try to compose the image the best that you can. And sometimes this can actually work really great, and other times you miss completely. And sometimes having a high burst rate can really help with the likelihood of getting a keeper, but at the same time, you also run the risk of them hearing your super loud blasting shutter. So again, your risk, your potential reward. Honestly, this is kind of what perverts do though, so prevent yourself from being thrown into the same camp and just practice a little bit of discretion. Now, on the topic train of pushing past fear, this tip is around being bold. And to be honest, there's not that much more to the tip. It's pretty straightforward. The thing is, the more you take risks in street photography, usually the better the images turn out, because in reality, there aren't very many people out there taking risks and getting those close shots or taking the same risks. Close shots just have a different vibe to them. They contain expressions and movements and shape and form that you just don't normally see in most street shots. They're characteristically pure in the sense that getting up close and personal and taking the shot is very similar to what you would experience if you were right there with that person as well. And there's a level of relatability and awe when it comes to the close shots. And I personally have a lot of respect for these street photographers who have made their careers on taking street photography images that are up close and personal. It isn't my style, that's for sure, but I respect how difficult it is because I've been there myself and have explored that style in depth for myself as well. It's not specifically the assignment for today's lesson, but I would definitely encourage you to at least try a few sessions where you limit yourself to using only a 24mm lens, something wide, and then getting up close and personal with people. It's definitely something to be experienced as a street photographer, and it builds up a lot of internal character. Okay, we're almost done here, but before we close out today's session, let's gather up some TLDRs and some rapid fire tips for general street photography. Street photography is all about the documentation of the human condition. It focuses candidly on photographing humans or the environment of humans and is a statement about how we live. I personally think that street photography has one of the most difficult skill sets to learn as a photographer, and as such I always recommend that photographers start here because the skills learned here are highly transferable to other genres of photography. Street photography requires you to be really good at the fundamentals so that you can react quickly to situations and scenarios and photograph them well. Things like shutter speed and focus especially are two main things that good street photographers require from a technical perspective amongst many others. The key when it comes to the craft of street photography is to become so in tune with your settings that you can quickly dial them in even without looking and within a second, so that you can be ready to capture anything at almost any moment with the absolute best settings every time. This journey can take some people a lifetime, so be patient with yourself. On the artistic side, street photography is perhaps one of the most broad genres in all of photography when it comes to subject matter, style, and preference. The amount of variance in terms of the subject matter as well as how to tell stories in street photography is tremendous, and your imagination is really the limit. That being said, it's also one where there is a lot of opinion and elitists. Don't listen to any of them and instead form your own opinion about what you think street photography should be to you and how it should be shot. While it's worth studying the vast history of street photography for inspiration and perhaps even some direction, in my opinion, it's not worth sticking to the traditional tropes or values of street photography unless certain creative constraints speak to you or serve you in how you express yourself. In terms of gear, there really isn't that much you absolutely need, but the two biggest considerations in my opinion are around focal length and autofocus performance. With focal length, it may help to start with a focal length that allows you a little bit more distance so that you can get used to shooting out in public and then start to learn the ropes a little bit easier without as much fear. Something like 50 or 85 millimeters is a great place to start, but don't end there. Try your hand at getting closer and closer to your subjects and being in their context. In many cases, and for many street photographers, that can yield significantly better images. And even if that doesn't end up being your style that you would eventually like to pursue, the skill set is insanely useful, especially when it comes to breaking through fear. When it comes to autofocus, the better autofocus performance you can get and the better you can quickly and accurately utilize that autofocus, the better. Modern autofocus is so good nowadays that we can now use fast lenses like f1.4 to add another dimension to our images in the form of shallow depth of field, which is something that the street photographers of old could never do. That being said, it's worth learning the focusing techniques of older street photographers out there as well. Skills like hip firing, zone focusing, and f8 and b, they're all fantastic techniques that you can still do in the modern era, and they will teach you a lot about capturing your subjects in terms of distance and speed, and they're insanely useful for helping you break through your barriers of fear as well. Remember to be as bold as you can be when getting up close and personal, but also remember to be kind and courteous as well. Don't act like a creep. If you're confronted at all, lean into the encounter and interact and compliment the person and help them understand what you were taking a photo of. Compliment them on their hat, their posture, their clothes, or whatever first caught your eye, rather than shying away and being awkward about it. Make them feel like they're interesting and worth taking a photo of. With street photography, at the beginning, it's far better, in my opinion, to take a lot of shots of anything that really interests you in general. For the time being, it's more beneficial to follow what interests you rather than trying to emulate styles or trends or tropes. And that's because there are so many different ways to do street photography, and you don't really know what you like until you find it. So experimentation and diversification is key. That being said, there's a lot of work of differing styles out there, so please do a lot of inspiration searching and research so that you can take a look at all the variants out there, because there's a lot. Over time, what you'll find is that you start to gravitate towards some styles over others, and you'll enjoy shooting some subjects and tropes more than others as well. While it's always good to challenge yourself to do new things and keep exploring and experimenting, it's also good to understand for yourself what specifically you like about certain styles and tropes, and then try to develop and work on those even further. Okay, assignment time. Similar to yesterday's assignment, today's assignment is all about planning as well, so that we can enable ourselves to get out there and actually do, rather than just sit here and learn theory all day. I mean, both are required for successful learning though. So the assignment for today is to plan a street photography shoot in the city that you're closest to, in a place that you have never been to before, and also at an unconventional time that you would really not normally shoot in. That just makes it a little bit more interesting. See what you can get at these unconventional times. Push yourself and see what happens. Bonus points if you end up going during the nighttime, because street at night is particularly difficult in terms of setting and environment, but it can be also extremely rewarding as well. All right, that's it for now. I'll see you tomorrow.